Welcome to NOAA Live. My name is Nicole Bartlett, and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. This series is sponsored by NOAA's Regional Collaboration Network, where I work, which is spread across the country and helps connect people to all that NOAA does. Our amazing partner is Woods Hole Sea Grant, located at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. To find out about future webinars, we've only got a few left. You can look under the Woods Hole Sea Grant Education tab on their webpage or simply follow them on Facebook. This is our 32nd webinar and the 11th week in a series designed to help you get to know NOAA and some of our incredible experts during school closures. All of our speakers work for some part of NOAA. That's NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Today, I'm going to introduce you to Tani Araneta with the Monitor National Marine Sanctuary in Newport News, Virginia. While we'll be talking about NOAA's role in maritime heritage, we want to recognize that we are all coming to you from traditional lands of Native communities who have substantial traditional and local knowledge and much to share with us. We acknowledge that Tani is coming to us from the land of the Potomac Indian Tribe of Virginia, and we're hosting this webinar from the ancestral lands of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe and the Wampanoag tribe of Gayhead Aquina. A few guidelines before I hand you over to our speaker. You're all muted because we have a lot of people on the line and we want to make sure everyone can hear Tani. However, there's a box where you can write questions, the same place where you told me where you were coming in from. We encourage you to ask them as we go, and we'll stop periodically and answer them. So we may not get to all of your questions, but we'll try to answer as many as we can. All right, Tani, are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Nicole. I think it's fantastic. Everybody's here. Thank you so much. Let me say aloha to my my friends joining us from Hawaii. I actually was raised on Maui, so went to St. Anthony's High School. So I went to University of Hawaii, so I'm stoked you guys are here. I also spent some time in Michigan working for the Thunder Bay Sanctuary, and I want to thank everybody for coming. A little bit about myself. My name's a little bit unusual. Tani Araneta is a Maori name, so I'm part Maori. My family's from New Zealand, so I'm very proud of that. And you know, my name sort of comes with me everywhere, so I explain who I am. But again, I was raised on Maui, started scuba diving when I was about 16 years old, and just loved to dive, and, you know, kept diving deeper and deeper and deeper until I finally got into trimix diving, you know, so deep diving, decompression diving, and then finally into rebreathers and things like that. I got into archaeology initially because as a little kid, I remember watching Dr. Robert Ballard discover the Titanic on TV, and, you know, it was so amazing. What it was just incredible. What is this thing? And then so it was always with me in the back of my mind. And then when I was in college at UH, University of Hawaii at Manoa, I always tried to figure out, you know, what are you going to do with your life? What's going to be your major? And I was initially a psychology major, and then realized for me that perhaps wasn't the best fit. And then I discovered archaeology, Hawaiian archaeology and history. And then one day I asked the head of the department, said, hey, is there anything to do this summer? Can I volunteer to help? And he said, hey, there's a underwater archaeology program just starting here. I was like, well, what's that? And then you reminded me that, you know, like Dr. Robert Ballard finding the Titanic and that kind of work, you can have a career in that. And that was sort of my launching pad into this field. I went to East Carolina University and got my master's degree. And I was so fortunate that about 20 years ago, I was brought onto the Monitor Sanctuary as a volunteer to help with these big projects we're going to talk about in this presentation. And I've been here ever since. So really excited to talk to you guys about the Monitor. So this is heavy metal on the high seas, the USS Monitor's legacy above and below the waves. So just to give you a little background on our National Marine Sanctuaries, we're part of NOAA. We are essentially like underwater national parks, and we're all across the country into the far Pacific. As you can see us here up and down the eastern seaboard. There's Florida, the Great Reef Monitor up to Stowagan Bank, the Great Lakes, you can see up here, and the West Coast, and of course the far Pacific, with the Hawaiian Islands Humpback Whale Sanctuary, the Papahanao Mokuokea Marine National Monument, and American Samoa that we see down here. You know, we're here to protect our natural and cultural resources, and all the sanctuaries have some cultural resources in it, but some are just focused solely on that, and there's 3 of them at the moment. Well, sorry, there's 2, and Actually, no, there's three. We're doing so much work working with these different sanctuaries that I actually lose track. But the Monitor was the first one. You can see us right here. But then there's also the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary in the Great Lakes. And we just have the newly established Mallows Bay Potomac River Sanctuary, which we're very excited by. We're also looking at Wisconsin, Lake Michigan right here is oncoming proposed sanctuary, hopefully about to happen. And we're also looking at Lake Ontario as well. But our story is going to be right here in the mid-Atlantic of the East Coast, the Monitor Sanctuary. So we're located here, the coast of North Carolina. You can kind of see us right there. Virginia is just above, and actually our office is right there. And the shipwreck sank down here. This is off the Outer Banks of North Carolina, area called Cape Hatteras. You can see right there. And we're about 16.5 miles offshore in about 232 feet of water. So pretty far out there and very deep, where these two currents collide, the Gulf Stream coming up from the south and the Labrador coming from the north. So it makes it really challenging to work here with these colliding currents and water temperatures, different kind of marine life and things. So it's not easy to get to the Monitor. So a lot of this happened during the U.S. Civil War. Does anybody heard of the U.S. Civil War before, or what happened?
Okay, let's see. So let's see, Catherine and James and Duncan, they've definitely heard of the Civil War. Anybody not heard of it? Or, oh, Catherine says she especially likes the ironclad ships, so you're in the right place. Yeah, it says, Connor and Daniel say the North beat the South and reunited the nation. Davis and Adelaide have not heard of it, so you might just tread a little softly when you go into it, but most folks are in the know.
Yeah, well, it happened back between 1861 and 1865, but essentially it's when the southern states seceded from the Union, which was the northern states, and you know, they had a belief that they had states' rights sort of based on slavery, and the northern part of the United States, the Union, and President Lincoln said, no, absolutely not, and we went to war. So this is part of that story, and a very big part of it. So our particular story began in April of 1861, where the state of Virginia seceded from the Union, from the United States. The U.S. Navy forces abandoned the Gosport Navy Yard by Portsmouth, which I'll show you in just a moment. And when they abandoned it because the South was coming up to take over this area, the Gosport Navy Yard was one of the main naval hubs that had a bunch of warehouses with ammunition, sort of weapons, naval supplies, and ships. And the Union Navy didn't want the South to get hold of these, so they burned it all because they couldn't take it with them and they couldn't let the South get it. So they burned the yard, the warehouses, and several ships. And one of those ships that was tied up to the dock that they burnt was the steam frigate, the USS Merrimack. And to give you guys a bit of an idea where we are here, so this is the Gosport Navy Yard down here in the south. This is the city of Portsmouth. This is the city of Norfolk, where I actually live. And then this is sort of coming up here, and this is what we call Hampton Roads. See that right there? So Hampton Roads is actually a series of waterways. It's not a highway on the road. It's actually literally roads for the ships coming in and out, up to the James River, the Hampton River over here, and so forth. And this is Newport News and Hampton. So this area right here was held by the United States or the Union forces, and their fleet was right through here. And this part was held by the Confederate forces, the South. You can see through here. So that gives you a little bit of idea the area we're working with. But there's that Gosport Navy Yard that the Union burned so the South couldn't get those supplies. So here's the USS Merrimack when she was afloat back in the late 1850s. So what the Confederates did, because they didn't have their way to build ships at the time, they didn't have that infrastructure. The whole economy was based on agriculture, growing cotton, things like that. They didn't have the big steel factories and things, so they had to use what they could. So they raised the Merrimack, you can see it here, and rebuilt it. And so this new sort of concept, this prototype called an ironclad. So what they did was they rebuilt the ship and then put iron on top of the wood, calling it ironclad. So it's not an iron hull, so it's clad in iron all the way around it. And it was sort of a strange, it almost looks like a new stealth ship, right, with these curved sides. And that wasn't like stealth ships have angled sides to bounce off sound waves, so you can't see them on radar. They did this at the time to bounce off cannonballs, so it would bounce off at an angle. But you can see it's very strange looking. But this is the CSS Virginia. And the South wanted the North to know they were building this. They put it in magazines. In fact, this picture is from Harper's Weekly, which is a national magazine that everybody could see, because they wanted to scare the North. They wanted to scare the people of the North. They wanted to scare the government of the North. They were building this monster that was going to come up and destroy the Union fleet, and the Union didn't have anything to fight it. So President Lincoln at the time realized that we couldn't have this. Something has to stop this ship. So they put out a contract or a bid for inventors to come in and propose different designs to fight the CSS Virginia. And the man that actually won was a very famous Swedish-American inventor called John Erickson. He was a naval genius, and he actually was awarded the contract with a really strange design to fight the Virginia. And I'll show you one of his early designs. And this is it. So it almost looks like one of those 1950s movies, flying saucers. It's really weird looking, right? Never seen anything like this before, like this weird bubble in this kind of strange shape. This is actually the water line here. So the whole thing's nearly underwater. And the innovative part, the new part, is this right here. And this is a revolving gun turret. So that means this little bubble here could spin, so the ship didn't have to move, but this turret moves and they could fire on its enemy. And this was the first time this has really been employed. So it's radical thinking, brand new, but this is the great-great-great-grandfather of all modern naval guns. So this is a concept he had in 1854.
Tani?
Little outlandish. Did it break out a little bit?
Yes, I'm sorry. I thought it was my internet, but I lost you for a second.
Oh, my apologies. As long as I'm back.
You're back. You're back.
So this is what he showed President Lincoln. So you can see it's the same concept with the turret right here, but this is a more sort of fleshed out design. So the revolving gun turret, 2 guns inside. You can see it on top, and you can see the blue of the water. And then you notice everything here is underneath. So this is where all the officers and crew lived and worked in the front area here. And here's all the engine spaces and back. So this is a radical new design. So not only was it the first time ever in the US Navy that all the men now are going to work underneath the water line, they also couldn't see the sky, which was bizarre. And oftentimes there's little clear pieces of glass here that let light in, and sometimes the water would wash over it and they'd see a fish and they'd freak out because they thought they were sinking, but they weren't. They're just psychologically, they're not used to being inside essentially an iron coffin. But this is the first time too that the officers and the crew lived and worked in the same spaces, because usually the officers would be in the back of the ship and the crew be in front. So now everybody's together. So it really was radical. So John Erickson was a man of, he has a very strong personality. He really had strong opinions. So when everybody saw this strange looking little ship, they thought, there's no way this thing's going to float. So John Erickson was insulted. So he stood on the deck of the ship as it slid off. It was being built in this warehouse. As it slid off this ramp into the water, he says, I'm going to stand on that ship and it's going to float within 8 inches of where I said it was, and I'll prove you all wrong. And lo and behold, he was right. So you can see again how weird this little ship is and how hard it would be to hit with a cannonball, right? Because everything's under the water and the only thing that's on top is really this gun turret. And this piece up here is actually where the captain stood and kind of peeked out and then yelled orders where to turn the ship. But just a strange looking little vessel. And here it is. So here's a great view of what the ship looked like. So what was also unique about the ship was not only was everything under the water line, this weird little gun turret, but you know, the Monitor represented really the best ideals of the United States. You know, this was a ship created to stop the Confederate threat. It was President Lincoln's way of saying, no, this is enough. This is enough for this Traitors Act of the Confederate States uprising against America. It's enough of racism and it's enough of slavery, and this ship embodies that. So this ship had African Americans aboard as crew. It had Protestants on board. It had Catholics on board. It has Jewish people on board. So at the time, it really represented what America looked like. And it's a very proud thing that is part of our naval heritage. So it's famous for being the first gun turret, but it's also famous for what it stood for in the fight against tyranny. And when we see the Monitor here against the Virginia, you can see they're really 2 different designs. Again, most of the ships are underwater and they're very hard to hit. You can see how the cannonballs would bounce right off here. on the Virginia, and there's not much to hit here on the Monitor. And the Monitor was also much smaller, so it was only about 12 feet underneath the water here. Well, the Virginia had about 23 feet, so a big, big lumbering beast. So I'm going to ask everybody, what do you think the ironclad CSS Virginia would do to the Union's wooden warships?
Okay, guys, so you've seen a little bit of an introduction to the Monitor. This radical, which means very different for the time. It was a very strange and kind of new design. What do you think is going to happen to the wooden warships that it's going to fight against? So Riley thinks it's going to ram right into them. Lillian thinks that those wooden ships are going to fall apart. It says, Jessica says it would rip those ships into shreds. Joshua says the wooden ships will sink. So a lot of people think it might run into the wooden ship. So they think that they're envisioning it sort of ramming it. Well, there's a lot of answers coming in. So hold on one second. Let's see. Oh, Riley says they can also launch red hot cannonballs and thinks it would set it on fire. So lots of good imagery here.
Yeah, and you're all right. You're all absolutely right. So the Battle of Hampton Roads on March 8th of 1862. So the Virginia, like I mentioned, the CSS Virginia was slow and unwieldy, but this Confederate ironclad monster had one of the most destructive maiden voyages in history. And I say a maiden voyage because this was the ship's first voyage out of the docks, really. The first time it threw its lines off and they took it out into Hampton Roads was this battle we're going to talk about. So in less than 8 hours on March 8th of 1862, the Virginia attacked the entire Union fleet in Hampton Roads, sinking 4 vessels, capturing a transport, and damaging 4 other ships. The destruction left behind 241 Union sailors that were killed and more than 100 wounded, and it was the worst U.S. Navy defeat until Pearl Harbor. In contrast, the crew of the Virginia suffered only 2 casualties, which only means 2 people were killed, and only a dozen of them were wounded. The Union vessels fought bravely. However, their guns were unable to penetrate the Virginia's armored casemate, which is that armored ironclad hull that it had at the outside of the ship. Virginia seemed absolutely unstoppable. That evening, when the USS Monitor finally arrived into Hampton Roads and encountered a scene of carnage, which means just everything was blown up, floating, and on fire, it was a scene of carnage and despair and sadness for the Union Navy. So the Monitor came in and took up a protective position next to the USS Minnesota, which was sort of one of the last ships that actually run aground there, and it was being fired on by the Virginia. And it really kind of buoyed their hopes, which means it really just, it glad that made them so happy that finally we have somebody that can stop this monster. So it made them happy they're there, but they're uncertain what was going to happen the next day. So on March 8th of 1862, the CSS Virginia became the world's most powerful weapon, but that was only for one day, until the next day, when the Union's USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia finally came head to head. So the Virginia was super confident for the previous day's victory. So they came right out from where they were docked back in towards Portsmouth and the Gosport Navy Yard, and they opened up firing a salvo, which means they fired a broadside of cannons from 1,000 yards out against the Minnesota. They hit the ship, it caused an explosion, caused a fire, right? So the Monitor quickly moved up and put itself in between the Virginia and the Minnesota, and then the battle began. So for the next 4 hours, these 2 ironclads circled one another, trading cannon fire in the point blank range, which means they're literally touching each other, sometimes ramming each other and bouncing off. But neither one was doing any real damage to the other. Each ship tried to ram the other one, and each commander tried to find a weak spot. But through it all, the Minnesota remained afloat, which was the whole point of the Monitor being there, was to protect that ship. But it did show that only an iron ship could stop another iron ship. So the battle that took place that day left neither the Virginia nor the Monitor seriously damaged, and both sides had actually claimed victory. But ultimately, historians have called the battle a draw. But in fact, there was one clear winner, which was this new ironclad technology, and the age of wooden warships was over. So that was the last time that the Virginia and the Monitor actually fought, because each one was so precious to each side. So the Union saw the Monitor be as this protective barrier that stopped Virginia from going anywhere, because the Virginia could have kept sailing up the rivers to the Potomac and actually maybe even shelled or fired upon what they thought maybe the White House in Washington, D.C. So the Monitor was there to stop that and to stop any more damage to the Union fleet. The Virginia was actually afraid to go out because that was the only one they had at the time, and they didn't want to damage it. So they actually never fought again. But the Monitor did go out. So they actually fired on different kind of shore forts that you can see here. So here's the Union fleet, the Monitor here, firing on a Confederate fort on the beach. That happened on March 8th. On May 15th, they actually helped in other sort of battles that happened. So the Navy would actually come up into these rivers in Virginia and help the Union Army by firing sort of shells from the ships here up into the land. And actually, Monitor is super lucky that a shell didn't get fired from the Confederates down at it, because even though the sides were heavily protected from cannonballs from ships, the top was actually pretty weak. So they're super lucky the cannonball doesn't drop to the top of the turret. And here's another one where they helped, again, the Union Navy was coming up in these rivers and helping these land battles. You can see examples here. So again, Monitor helped a little bit, but didn't really participate in any other big actions. And here's a great example of what Monitor's daily life was like, in July and August in 1862. Here's the deck. You can see this is sort of a cross section of America. Look at all these guys, these sort of rough looking guys here. Got an African-American guy sitting right here. Probably got some guy from Ireland over here, some Italian dudes back here. But they're all living and working together. And you might think, like, why is everybody up here on the deck? Well, if you guys have ever been in the South in summertime, it's really hot. So it's even hotter inside this iron ship. So it's so hot, they actually kind of lived and worked up here. So this is our little cook stove, and these poor guys are just trying to get a breath of fresh air. And that brings us to December 30th of 1862, when Monitor was ordered to go south from Hampton Roads of Virginia to North Carolina, which is the state just below us, to an area called Beaufort. So it was being towed by this vessel here, which is the USS Rhode Island, which is a side paddle wheeler, which means it had paddle wheels instead of sails, propeller right there. It was being towed, and the weather was pretty good. But again, weather forecasting, especially with NOAA, has come a long way. So they knew that weather was pretty good. So they left the seas, and it was being towed because the Monitor couldn't go that fast. This helped to go even faster. But because the weather forecasting is much better today than it was then, they didn't know a storm was coming. They got caught up in a huge storm, 15, 20-foot waves rolling over the decks. You can kind of see here, the water's just everywhere. So they fought it as long as they could until the captain finally had to realize they had to give up the ship, raise this red signal lantern, you can see right there, to show that, hey, we've got an abandoned ship. We need help to get our men off. So what this painting shows is this is a rowboat from the Rhode Island, and it went back and forth bringing men for the Monitor and saving them and taking back to the ship. So this went on for about 4 hours in the dead of night, total blackness. All the thing they could see is this bobbing red lantern, until finally, with 16 men still left to be saved, the red signal lantern disappears and the Monitor sinks. And that's the last we hear of her, with 16 men going down with her. So you guys, do you have any questions about what the Monitor did during Civil War at sinking?
Ooh, wow. So that was a nice history lesson. A couple of questions. One person asked, when you said, I can't remember the name of the ship, but when they modified it to make it the USS Virginia, you said the ship was raised. What does that mean?
Oh, I'm sorry. So it was the USS Merrimack. So by raised it, I mean like they literally raised it, they picked it up. So it had sunk down at its dock where it was tied up. So they raised it back up, they picked it back up again, refloated it, and then pulled it into sort of a dock, drained the water out, and they rebuilt it. So that's what I meant by that.
Got it. And we did have a question about what radical meant, but I defined that. How many men were on the ship total?
The Monitor had about 100, no, excuse me, I'm thinking of the Virginia. The Monitor had about 71 to 73 thereabouts during the battle. When it sank, it had about 60 to 63. But because the Virginia was so much bigger, it had about 200 men aboard. So there's a lot more people on that ship.
Okay, so we're getting a bunch of questions here, so let me just keep track. Let me see who asked. Anna asked who won the battle, and you had said that both sides claimed victory for that battle that you at Hampton Roads, right?
Absolutely, yeah, and because we could talk about that battle all day long, but essentially the Monitor had pulled in to shallower water because the captain had been hurt. So when they did that, the Virginia said, "Oh, look, the Monitor's turning tail and running. You know, they can't take the fight and they're going in." But they weren't. They were just getting a little break to change captains and go back out to fight again. So when the Virginia saw that, they turned back to their own shore, their own base, because they're like, "Hey, we won! Yay, we're celebrating!" So that when the Monitor saw Virginia leave, as they came back, like, "Oh, the Virginia's turning tail and running. You know, the cowards are leaving. We won." So both sides claims victory. But again, that's why we say it was a draw, where it was an even fight, but the loser was wooden warships.
Okay, Owen has one more question that I'm interested in too. How did the Monitor get its name? Do you know?
Yeah, it was actually
Oh, hold on one second. Everybody stand tight for a second. We just got a little glitch with Tane, so let's be patient and see if he comes back.
when it was being. If you guys are you able to hear me yet?
Now we
Am I
can hear
back?
you. Yep,
Okay.
now we can hear you.
So the Monitor didn't have a name when it was being built. They called it the Erickson battery, and a battery was meant to be just like a floating gun battery, essentially a floating like a barge with a gun on it, which is just a flat ship. So the John Erickson actually named the ship uh, right before it was launched as the Monitor because it was going to monitor sort of the coast. It was going to protect the coast. So he named it that to protect it, and he actually wrote the name on all of the place where the plates and things in different parts of the ship at his own cost. He paid for that because he was so proud of the ship. But John Erickson named the ship Monitor.
Okay, one last question before we get, because we're getting a lot of questions I know you're going to cover in the next session. But Bridget asked a good question about the design. Did they make the propeller in a special way so that the boat couldn't be seen?
Ah, yeah. Well, we're going to get to that. So, yeah, they did in a way. So, John Erickson was one of two people who are credited or given credit for designing the first modern propellers, like we see on boats today, like a little fishing boat, right? That propeller. He's the guy that invented that design. Well, one of two people credited. So, the propeller is very special. It was underneath the water and below that iron side, so it was totally protected, so nobody could shoot it. But again, that's another thing that makes monitors so special.
All right, well, I think everyone's excited to find out what happens next. So,
Ah, all right. So for nearly 100 years, Monitor is left on the seafloor, lost to time, until about 1973, when a group of scientists led from folks in North Carolina. We got Duke University, you got the North Carolina Department of Cultural Resources that has historians and archaeologists that work for them. MIT, you guys might have heard of, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and of course, National Geographic. They all teamed up to try to find the Monitor. And they were using this newly designed equipment that was used to sort of image the seafloor. So they called it sort of geomorphology is like the scientific word for it, but they're using it to image the seafloor. And this was back in the times in the Cold War when we were fighting the Russians with our submarines. So, the Russians were trying to track us, we were trying to track them. And this was a device that could not only scan the seafloor, but it could find very specific shaped objects. And because the Monitor is a very specific shape, very unusual, that if they could prove that they could find the Monitor with this, then it could be used for other things like finding Russian submarines. So we were just very lucky at the time in the 70s that they wanted to point sort of this new technology, testing it at finding our ship. So they went out in 73 to try to find it. And lo and behold, on the very last day of the project, as it always seems to happen, you might go out there for 3 months trying to find something, and you literally only find it on the last day. This was their last day out at sea. They finally find something called a long amorphous echo from a side scan sonar. It's a sonar image. And this is it right here. So a weird looking shape, doesn't look like a rock. It looks pretty, there's a pointy end, sort of another pointy end. kind of a shape here. It might be sides of the ironclad, maybe. So very, very promising, right? You don't know for sure, but it looks very promising. So they went back out and they dropped some cameras, which you can kind of see here. They didn't really have video cameras at the time, and they did, but very primitive ones, and a still camera, and they tried to take pictures of it. And this is really pretty deep for scuba diving at the time, so this is really the only way they had to do it. So this is what they found. So in 1974, they were studying all the images in the video. The video is all blurry and the pictures were kind of blurry, and they're trying to put them together. So they finally realized that, wait a second, what if the ship is upside down and the ship is on top of the turret? Maybe that's what we're looking at. And when they really looked at it again, they put the pieces together, that's what they found. So it took them about a year, but after they looked at all the data, they discovered that yes, indeed, they had found the Monitor. And because the Monitor was so far offshore, it was really something called the high seas at the time, which meant it was sort of in no man's land. It wasn't in the United States waters really at the time. It wasn't in state waters. So how do you protect it? How do you preserve this history so no one damages it? So something was just created a few years before called NOAA. And then the National Marine Sanctuaries was also created then just a few years after that. So they had this piece of this law that you could put into effect that was really made to protect coral reefs and things like that. But it had one little line in there about cultural resources or archaeological resources. That could be historic things like ships. So it wasn't the designer's plan for this to be the first National Marine Sanctuary, but because we were able to find a little caveat that would protect cultural resources, which the Monitor is, we were able to make Monitor the very first National Marine Sanctuary on January 30th of 1975. And we're very proud that it's the 113th anniversary of the ship's launch when it was launched in New York. So what was really exciting, sort of that time period in the 1970s, which I know for a lot of these people seems a long time ago, but there's all sorts of undersea exploration going on. There's little submarines with people diving out of them. This is an example right here. This is actually an archaeologist. This is actually one of my professors, but he also worked for North Carolina, Dr. Gordon Watts. And he is actually, you can see a scuba tank in here. He's got a mask on, a little hard to see. And this tether that feeds him air that he's breathing off of from a submarine. So he actually is in the bottom of this submarine. He comes out here and he can work and document the shipwreck site. And I was lucky enough to be in the same submarine many years later, this sort of big sort of bubble. But they were doing everything they could to document this ship. And one of the very first artifacts that we found on the ship was that red signal lantern. Remember the one that signaled on the night of its sinking that they were going to abandon ship? Well, this is it. This is it right here. And it was found right off the bow, which is the front of the ship. So being we're the Modern National Marine Sanctuary, we have a budget and we have plans and things that we do. So we knew we wanted to bring this up. So we had a whole budget in place. We had museums we were going to work with and a way to conserve it, which means a way to kind of protect it so you could take it out of the water and put it on display. So we had this whole plan in place. It was approved and we brought it up. And now you can see this on display at the Mariners Museum and Park in Newport News. It's just beautiful. And the same thing here with the anchor. And again, because the Monitor was such a weird little ship, every part had to be designed by hand by John Erickson. So this is a very special anchor he designed. And then we also realized that, hey, the Monitor is an iron ship. And if you guys know anything about iron and salt water, iron corrodes really quickly compared to other metals. So the idea was that the Monitor is corroding and we want to protect and share parts of the ship with the American public. How do we do that? Can we do it? So we did a whole plan and we said the most important thing we want to do is bring up this gun turret, which you can see right here. So here's what the ship looked like on the bottom of the sea. Here's the armor belt, which is the side of the ship. Remember, the ship's upside down. Here's the turret underneath it, but on top of it was the engine. We also had a propeller and shaft, which is here. And then this is the forward part that sort of slightly collapsed. So to get to the turret, we actually have to cut away these different parts. So you can kind of see here what it's like when we found it.
Okay, hold tight, folks. We lost Tani again. Let's give him 1 second to come back to us.
This area, apologize about that.
Yeah, okay, so you were just saying, here's what the ship originally looked like.
Yeah, and then we had to cut away this part of the armor belt here, get the turret and bring it up, and then help stabilize that or help protect there what's left. So it sounds easy, right? Well, not so much. So it was a really difficult project to do. So here's the first one we did. So in 1998, we brought up the propeller when we talked about that a little bit earlier. So this is actually all underneath the water. This is where the side of the ship would have been. Here it is underneath. So again, it kind of looks kind of primitive, like an early design, but that's what a modern propeller kind of is based on. So we cut that right here and brought this whole thing up. So here it is underwater. Here it is working with the United States Navy, helped us recover it. And there it is just coming out of the water. And now here it is on display after conservation. So now everybody can come up and look at this ship. So that was the first part. The second part is the engine. So here's a great video if y'all can see it. So this is from the middle of the ship going back towards the back, or what's called the stern. Here's the area above where the engine is. This is the sort of the lower hull, the bottom of the ship. And this big structure here, man, this is about like 50 feet tall, about 80 feet across. And this frame here is actually this guy here. So we dropped that down, bolted it to the back, attached the engine to it, and brought the whole thing up. And that's what you can see right here. So that's the engine that was specifically designed to fit inside the Monitor by John Erickson too. So again, not only did he design the ship, the turret, the propeller, the engine, and the anchors. So just, it's incredible. So that was 2001.
Just a quick question. So the image on the left, if you can just explain to folks, so that is a ship on station above the Monitor.
Right, so this is a gigantic barge.
Yeah.
That we actually brought up from the Gulf of Mexico. So yeah, that's right here. So the next year, now it's time to get the gun turret. So this is the big one. So we had removed the deck and the armor belt. You can see here is gone. So the turret's all open. But what is this inside? We didn't expect to see that. So what had happened, because we couldn't see it, it was covered by the deck of the Monitor. So what had happened when the vessel sank is that there was something called a coal bunker, which is a coal, think of like coal that you put in a fireplace. Well, the Monitor ran on coal. It didn't run on oil or gas. It had to burn coal and something called its boilers to move the engine. So it had a storage area called a bunker, which opened up, it broke open and dumped all the coal inside the turret. So again, we couldn't see this and didn't expect it. So we now had to do an emergency excavation to remove all of that before we could even think about bringing the turret up. We also had to remember that we might find human remains in there. There might be skeletons, part of the Monitor's crew, because this was the only way for people to get in and out of the ship during the storm was through the turret, through the roof. So we had to be really careful. So how did we do that? How did we get this thing? So again, working with the United States Navy and a group called Oceanographic, another one called Phoenix Engineering. These groups all work with NOAA, and we built this giant thing here called a spider. So think of it like a giant claw, right? So like even this claw, like in the like an amusement park, you see where you put the quarter in, you try to pick up a little furry animal. Well, it's kind of similar. So these legs open up, they close down around the turret very gently, and we make sure it's all secure. Then we pick it up and move it over to this part we called a platform. The two were bolted together, and then the whole thing came up together, so it was very secure and nothing would fall out. So again, I keep talking about the United States Navy, and they were such a crucial part of this. So here's an example of what it was like working with them. So here's a submarine. This is the Johnson Sea Link submarine. We're research scientists looking here. Here's a US Navy diver, and this is sort of an umbilical that's attached to this guy that I'll talk about in a second. So he's walking along the edge of that armor belt, which is the side of the ship. We've already cut away the deck, and now you can see that spider structure is around the turret there. So it was absolutely incredible. It's almost like working in some sort of James Cameron underwater science fiction movie. It was amazing. But these Navy divers here would come down from the ship, and sometimes they would come down in this thing called an elevator stage, which would lower them down, or they would come in here and it's called a saturation diving bell. So they were doing saturation diving, which is this crazy deep diving, decompression diving. So instead of most divers that stay down for about an hour or so, they could stay down at days at a time using this super high technology. So we were just very privileged to be able to work with the United States Navy and our partners. But NOAA also had a piece to play here. So we had what's called a technical dive team. If you mentioned this is something I used to do, we wear these giant tanks on our back. You can see here all our partners here, all our folks kind of got a big tanks. We got tanks under our arms and all sorts of things. So we would go down and we do decompression diving there, which is a whole big process we can get into at a different time, but essentially allows us to go down, work at these deep depths, and then slowly decompress and come up. But we could get about maybe half an hour on the bottom, where the Navy could get like days on the bottom. So a little bit of difference there. But I like to think of us as the scalpel. So we would go down and we would find artifacts, we'd document them, we would bring them up very gently. We would do all the little things, and the Navy was more like the big buzzsaw, right? They would come in and do the big heavy work. So we worked together to help bring this artifact up. So Nicole mentioned what was that ship that things were being brought up on, and this is it, sort of a gigantic 300-foot barge, which is a big sort of floating island, and it was an island. We had about 100 people on here, men and women divers. So we got a big crane. Here's the crane here, and here's the structure, and this is how we brought it up with the turret. So again, it looks like it's very easy on paper, but it took a lot of work. So because the Monitor was made of iron and it's so heavy, so we got a question for you. How many elephants do you think the USS Monitor's turret weighs?
Okay, so let's see your best guesses. Right out of the gate, Riley says 50. We got another guess of 2,000. We've got 500. We've got 1,000. Duncan says 16. Colton says 5. Let's see. Wow, is that Nick is guessing 100,000? So I think that's our top end. And then we have our conservative estimate of 1. So.
Maybe.
It's kind of like The Price is Right, although right. I'm sure nobody here but you and I know what I'm talking about with The Price is Right. Let's see, 40 says Miles. Noah guesses 100. And Eli wants to clarify, you do mean full-grown elephants, correct?
I would say a full-grown African elephant.
Okay. All right. If that changes your answer, let me know. Liam says 185. And let's see. Kyle says 10, and thank you, Duncan, for knowing what The Price is Right is. I appreciate that. Okay, so yeah, I think, and Lillian's getting in her last guess of 200.
Okay, all right. Well, that's pretty close. So it's actually 230 elephants. So when we finally raised the turret on August 5th of 2002, after a 45-day mission with a hurricane about to hit us, we brought it up and got it up on the deck of that barge, and it weighed over 230 tons when it finally broke the surface. So you guys were all pretty close there, but I think that last one was the closest there, 200. So yeah, 230 tons. It's really heavy.
Well, Lydia was going to say 250, so I wanted to let you know that.
Oh, okay, almost close too. So you might look at that and think, oh, well, the job's done, right? You guys brought it up and it's on the surface. What more do you have to do? Well, now the really hard work begins. So for this whole project, looking at the Monitor, I would say maybe 20% of that is actually what happened out on the water, and all the rest of the project happens on land. So there's still a ton of work to do, and maybe the hardest work. So now, if you remember, that turret was still filled with, rocks, coal, mud, little marine critters that sort of died as they came up, little sponges and little crabs and things. So we had to get all of that out very carefully because there's still artifacts in there. One of them is my friend Wayne Lasardi. He's actually the state underwater archaeologist in Michigan. And he actually recovered the lantern that was inside there. So when those poor guys were waiting for rescue inside the turret, this lantern lit the way. That gave them the light. So there's so many stories to tell. And this is actually me way back in olden times. But again, how do you map something this huge that's in, it has walls and there's a top and sides, and it's so hard to do. So in archaeology, we actually look at things as a grid, right? Straight lines that you put down, you kind of map things. So we're very lucky that the Monitor has lots of straight lines on the roof, because don't forget, the whole thing's upside down. So the roof provided that. So these lines here across, these big beams, and these ones here too. So they helped us. Once we had mapped those in, then we could place all the little artifacts that we found. And if you remember, I mentioned there might be human remains, or the crew left, and we did actually find 2 crew members within there. So we actually found indications they were there when we were still at sea. So we had representatives from the United States Navy and Department of Defense. That's their job, to help document and protect these guys. So we worked hand in hand with them. But here's where they were. So they're right here and here. There's two of them, and they can see they're right kind of there and there. But these two guys were waiting for rescue when the ship went down. So they're here inside the turret, and that lantern that you just saw gave them the light. So, you know, it's exciting working on these projects with the ships and the guns and battles, but we can never forget this is really a human story, and we can never forget the folks that died as part of this project. But again, how do you map this thing? So this is a great example here, this video. So we actually worked with NASA, and they did a laser scan inside there. So they had a laser that sort of swept back and forth inside the turret, so we can map this thing in it created a three-dimensional model. You can kind of see here's another representation of it, because it is very hard to map these things. We had to do it right the first time. And this is all happening with our partner in Newport News, which is the Monitor Center and the Mariners Museum and Park in Newport News, Virginia. So we worked together to help build this facility. You know, we both helped fund it. You can see here in the front is a full-scale monitor rebuilt that you could walk the decks and see what it's like. You can see displays and artifacts from the ship, tells a story of the Civil War, story of Monitor, and you can see the artifacts being conserved too. And here's that gigantic Monitor Center Conservation Laboratory. This is the outside of the building. So these are the giant.
Okay, audience, we'll just be patient for 1 second while Tani returns to us. Okay, let's see. Okay, there you are. You're back. Sorry, we lost you. Yeah, we lost you just as you were going over to the slide.
Oh, all right. It must be a sun flare or something. But here's the giant tanks. So the turret is inside here, the gun turret. Here's the engine, and so the conservators there, those professionals that work to preserve these materials can work. But also, you see these pieces of glass here. We knew this would take years and years to do, so we wanted to make sure that the public could come and look down and see what was going on. We wanted to make sure it was an open door so you could come and be part of that history as we make it together. Here's the lab inside. It almost looks like something out of NASA, right? With all these white tables and things to clean objects and make sure they're preserved. So here's some of those things that we found. So this is what tells the people's story. So one of those individuals that we found in the turret was wearing a gold wedding ring. And here it is. You know, shows that, you know, he was married, and he's got a story behind him. And their jackets had buttons, United States Navy, USN, you can see that there. And here's part of an anchor and things. And one of them was wearing boots. There's the boot, you know, parts of line.
Okay, so Tani, we lost you again.
And,
we lost you at the boot.
Okay, am I back?
Yes, you are. I can't, your video's not moving, but I can hear your sound.
Okay, well, I'm also showing a small glass container that held mustards and relish, because just like today in the military, you get an MRE, meals ready to eat. So that's what our soldiers eat when they're deployed. So too, they get Tabasco and things to spice up the meal, because the meals don't maybe taste that great. So in the Civil War, they gave soldiers and sailors the same thing. So lots of mustard and relish and pepper bottles. So that's one of these. And another human connection is that the officers on the ship often brought their own silverware with them. So the ship didn't give them silverware. They often brought it themselves. So they had their initials in the silverware. So here's examples of that. And these are all examples. The silverware we found was all from officers that died during the sinking. So here's SAL, a little hard to see, USN under United States Navy. SAL is Samuel A. Lewis, or Samuel Augie Lewis, you can see here. But again, it tells that people's story. This belonged to somebody that uses every day. And it reminds us about the human toll that all these projects that we talk about and we have to remember. But other parts of the conservation, again, the ship is huge. We've brought up thousands of artifacts. So here's one of the pumps that help move the water out of the ship and circulated water around. One of these gun carriages. John Erickson also invented the gun carriage. And a gun carriage is like a carriage, if you think that's something back in the day that used to carry things with it. Well, this is what the cannons would go on as it rolled back and forth. So that's being conserved. And the engine, we can't forget about the engine. So here we are in 2010, you can kind of see it's all this crusty looking stuff on it. So for us to conserve it, all of that has to come off. And then we have to take the whole thing apart and conserve it, which means do different treatments on it and then rebuild the whole thing. So it's a massive project. So here's in 2010, and we'll go through some slides and you see how it's gradually getting cleaned. So this is a little bit better, and a little bit more, a little bit more, and even better. So you can see each time it's getting cleaner and cleaner and cleaner until finally 7 years later in 2017, all of that covering is gone. So now the next step, you think it's done, but it's not. So now the whole thing has to come totally apart, conserve it, treat it, and then rebuild it again. So again, we're very proud to do this project, but it's a lot of work. And we've got like 10 or 15 years left till it's done. And then there's the turret, right? So the turret is 9 feet tall and 22 feet across. So we've got to do the same thing. So here's the conservators from the Mariners Museum working away. And you can kind of see here, you see all these bolts, you can see there, and you see this piece here, we called it a nut guard, and these are sort of nuts and bolts. So what would happen was this piece right here would actually cover this because they were afraid if a cannonball hit the outside, it would break off these nuts and they would bounce around and hurt somebody. So each one of these strips here had actually one of these covers there. So you can see how that all has to come apart. And again, just like we did when we first brought the turret up, we work with the latest technologies, digital scans, laser scans, rebuilding this thing in 3 dimensions. So it's not just accurate within a foot or so, this thing is accurate within a millimeter. So we can actually rebuild it and document it in time. Here's some great example of that the Mariners Museum is doing today. So because this iron piece was in salt water, you've got to get that salt out because that's what causes rust, right? If you've ever seen a piece of metal by the ocean, it gets rusty, it turns this red color. So we need to get the salts out of that so it stops corroding and stops rusting. So what they do is they fill this tank with fresh water and they put this metal mesh. It almost looks like a fence inside it with all these little PVC pipes, and the PVC just helps to kind of separate it. So what that does is that they actually hook up an electrical current to it, and the electricity actually pushes out the electrons from electricity, actually push out the sodium chloride ions from the salt. Sodium chlorides are salt. So it actually pushes that out kind of within the molecules, and it pushes it out and into the water. We clean the water, replace it with fresh water, and you just keep flushing it year after year after year. So not only all this other work we're doing, this is sort of the bigger work that's happening too. So again, we hope to have this on display with all this off it in maybe about 10 years, just because it's so big. But we can't, again, I keep talking about this being a people story. We can't forget about those poor men that lost their lives that night of December 31st of 1862. There are 16 men that went down, 16 heroes that died. So there were 2 of them that we actually brought up, recovered. We worked with the United States Navy to try to help identify those folks. We weren't able to do it. We wanted to find their descendants, their relatives, if we could. We didn't. So when we had a ceremony, again, working with the United States Navy, we buried those 2 guys in Arlington National Cemetery. And it was really, we had 10,000 people show up. So you can see their coffins right here being honored by the honor guard here. A huge service we had on the grounds. And now they're buried here in Arlington with the 16 other men all being honored because we don't know who they were. So we're honoring everybody that was part of that sinking. That happened 151 years after the Battle of Hampton Roads. And here's what we think those 2 guys look like. So they actually took their skulls, because we had the skull, they scanned them and created sort of a model from them. And working with Louisiana State University, it's the same university that the FBI works with for sort of crimes where they want to rebuild a skull to see what the person looked like. We use those same people, and this is what they think they look like. So here's individual 1, sort of an older male, and a younger male right here. And here they are. So when we look at the historic photographs, we think we know who these folks might be. So there's one individual called Robert Williams. He was a Welshman, and he died during the sinking and you can see him standing right here, arms crossed, kind of a big brute of a guy. You can see his chin, but if you look at his chin here, his eyes and his nose, it's very similar. This guy is very distinctive, and he was actually the same height as he might be as well. So we think we've got a really good idea who this might be. We don't know for sure, but you know, it's so special to be able to look at this photograph and be like, wow, I really think that's him. So again, that's part of that story and the legacy that we're telling. So a lot of ways to learn about us. You know, you can come down to North Carolina to any of our many museums we partner with. You could come to the Monitor Center at the Mariners Museum and Park in Newport News, where we work. We have an office, but we have trail signs all up and down the East Coast in North Carolina, Virginia, and New York, where the Monitor sort of story was told as it went from New York, where it was built, all the way down to North Carolina, where it sank. And we partner with a bunch of folks, National Park Service, city parks, all sorts of people to put these fun trail signs in. We also have a buoy, a data buoy that's out of the site, because we want people to dive on the Monitor. You can get a permit through us, come dive it, come enjoy it. Maybe you want to fish in the area, you're welcome to as well. So this is really the only data buoy, and a data buoy gives you, tells you how fast the wind is moving, how strong the current is, what the waves are like, you know, all sorts of things. So again, it's just something that we're proud to be able to share as part of NOAA, with our NOAA family, to share with the public out there. So we want everybody to come out, enjoy the Monitor and coastal North Carolina. And another fun way to do it too, you think like, hey, if I want to learn about the Monitor, where do I go? I go to a history museum. Well, it's one place, but why not aquariums too? So we work with a number of aquariums, especially in North Carolina. And this one in Roanoke Island, we just helped them revamp part of their exhibit. So they have a quarter scale, which means just slightly smaller than the real ship. We have a replica of that ship in a giant tank with sand tiger sharks swimming around it. We've got all these new stories. We've got artifacts on display, and we've got a replica turret you can walk into, and you can see a sort of a replay through a movie we have inside of what the battle was like in the sinking. So it's just another fun way to learn about it, and also the marine life there. You know, these things were once weapons of war. They're warships, but now on the bottom of the sea, they're great places for fish to live and have a habitat, and they call the fish their homes. So diving on the Monitor and the other shipwrecks of Carolina, you know, you could learn about history, but also if you love marine life too, you love fish and sharks, it's a great place to go. And this is what the Monitor looks like today. It's still a great shipwreck. There's still lots to learn. This is sort of the, and remember, it's upside down, which makes it looks a little bit weird. So part of it is buried. This part is the armor belt. Remember that side of the ship that the cannonball bounced off of? Here's the bow, the pointy end right there. And this is the area right back here where we took the turret. But this whole area here in the center was where all the men lived and worked. So there's tons and tons of stories yet to tell. And we're very honored to really talk about the Monitor and what it represented. Because remember, this is what President Lincoln put forward to stop the Confederacy when he said there was enough of what was happening. The United States can't tolerate that racial injustice that's occurring. It can't tolerate these one people being put forward to another, and the Monitor was there to stop that. And with its multi-diverse crew, with African Americans, Protestants, Jews, Catholic, all sorts of folks, America coming together to stop that Confederate threat. So we're very proud to tell that story. And there she is. There's the Monitor, where she is today off North Carolina. So we honor that legacy, and I'm so happy to share it with you guys. And that's the end of my presentation.
Well, Tani, you were wonderful. We have a few questions, and I'll get to those now quickly. I know we're already at time, but we had a couple of good ones. The obvious ones from Owen and Joshua, they want to know if we're ever going to raise the whole ship.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So we actually looked at doing that, but to be honest, it was so expensive to do it. And the fact that if you remember that slide I showed you of that full-scale replica at the Mariners Museum, we realized we didn't have to do that. So what we wanted to do is bring up those most important parts, which was the gun turret, the engine, the propeller, and things like that too. But we feel the best place for it is still on the seafloor, where you can enjoy it and see it. And you know, it's still a gravesite with those other men that are down there too. So our thought is we want to leave it there for folks to share.
Oh, I think you froze on
Leave
us.
it.
There you go. Okay, we got you back.
Okay.
Next time we do this, I'm going to have to set you up in a better internet location. So let's see. Do you, someone's asking, I think it's Bridget, someone wants to know about that thing on top of the turret that looks a lot like a tent. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, that is a tent. So what they did was, because it was so hot from the sun, is it literally, it is like a tent, like a circus tent. So it had a big piece of canvas and sort of a pointy top that it would go through, and these iron sides that would go up and hold it. So yeah, you're exactly right. It's a tent like you would see on the beach. That's exactly what that is.
And you had mentioned that it's at a depth of, I think you said 233 feet. Is that right?
Yeah, thereabouts. Yep.
Okay. So for those of us who aren't divers, is that a depth that requires special diving equipment and training?
It does. If you're a scuba diver, the recreational normal scuba depths are 130 feet or less than that. So 232 feet is 100 feet deeper than that. So it takes very special training, very special equipment, and lots of practice to be able to do it. You can do it. There's training out there. I encourage people to, but yeah, you definitely have to be specially trained.
That reminds me, we are talking to the NOAA Dive Center on Monday, so that allows me to do a nice plug for the diving training that NOAA provides, and I'm sure Tani has gone through some of that. Can you, someone mentioned, you might know him, Admiral Gallaudet wants to make sure that you got some credit for being one of those technical divers that helped bring up that turret. So
I did.
Yes.
Yeah, I was actually one of the first ones out of the gate. My boss, John Broadwater at the time, was the very first one. But yeah, I'm happy to be sort of one of the first folks to help pave the way for NOAA with lots of other people. But yeah, it's a proud thing that our NOAA diving program is able to help and support.
And a couple more quick questions. I know we have to go, but someone wants to know what happened to the USS Virginia?
That's a great question. So the Virginia, again, if you remember when I talked about, it was at the Gosport Navy Yard. So it really didn't leave that area. So when the North started having victories and they moved from where they were in Norfolk down south across Hampton Roads into the sort of the Norfolk area, they took back that Gosport Navy Yard. So the Virginia had nowhere to go or to escape to. It was too big to really take the open seas. They didn't want the North to get it because the North would use it against them. So they actually took it out, filled it with black powder or ammunition, kind of like a giant firecracker, and they blew it up. So it exploded. In fact, the explosion was so big that it broke the windows in the opposite shore. And then it's totally destroyed. So when people say that they think they've found it today, they haven't. The ship is completely obliterated.
Wow. That is amazing. Let's see. Davis, I wanted you to clarify, but just so the kids understood. Davis asked, why was the turret so dirty and there was stuff all over it? And I thought you might want to go over that one more time.
Yeah. Well, what it looked like it was dirty, that was rust. And then what like it looked like mud. So what happens when it was buried, all that sort of stuff grew around it because it was down there for, over 100 years. So sponges, corals, things called it home. And as they sort of died, another one grew on top. And it sort of kind of creates all these different layers. So when it came out of the water, it looked all crusty and lumpy. That's because all the mud had caked to it. You'd have different layers of coral, different layers of sponges, and other kind of marine life. So those are some of the things we had to very gently take off, but not damage the metal underneath.
And so if people want to learn more about these ironclad ships, were there more than just the two, the Virginia and the Monitor?
Yeah, so the South, the Confederates learned how powerful the Virginia was, that design. So they built a small fleet, but they built a whole fleet of those type of vessels, but they only really worked in the river systems. They never really went to sea, the ironclad design. And the Union Navy, the United States Navy, built a whole class of monitor vessels. So some of them had 2 turrets on top, some had 2 propellers, some were made to be on the open sea, so they had very bigger holes. It wasn't just flat on the bottom. So there was all different classes of them. I think they built over 60 different monitor vessels by the U.S. Navy by the time they're sort of changing into battleships and things like that.
Wow, well, people are very interested in this topic. So I hope Tani's given you a lot of additional thoughts there if you want to go do some more research of your own. So then the significance of the Virginia and the Monitor is that they were really the first ones. They kind of kicked the whole thing off.
Yeah, exactly. So these designs have been talked about in Europe, so they had built some of these vessels and things, but the first time they actually fought together head to head was the Battle of Hampton Roads. And that's why that battle is so important. And the whole world watched. They wanted to see what would happen. How is this new crazy technology going to work? And it proved this is the way forward. So again, I keep saying it, but the Monitor is the great-great-grandfather to all modern Navy warships. And that's a United States heritage that we have in the US Navy.
Well, I think it's a really amazing story that you shared with us today, especially since, so you said you've been working on the Monitor for 20 years?
Oh, good Lord, yes.
Yeah, so I think he's definitely an expert. So to Morgan, who wants to know how he knows all the information about this shipwreck, I think it's because he's been doing it for a very long time and very focused on this. So we are so proud to have you at NOAA, of course, and just grateful for all the work you did to preserve this history for us and that you're continuing to do. So our kids, if you want to learn more, we've got a lot of website links, and you can click on those under Tani's webinar on the NOAA Live page. As I mentioned, next week we have a little bit more talk about diving, how we train divers, the type of equipment they use, and things that they have to do in training. We're also going to go to Thunder Bay and talk to someone in Michigan, one of the other sanctuaries that Tani mentioned. And then on Wednesday, we got so many requests. We had to add a jellyfish talk. So next week, before we wrap things up, we are going to be talking about jellyfish. And then on Friday, of course, we're bringing back all your favorite all-stars that you voted for our final webinar on the 12th during the school year. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Tani. Everybody have a nice weekend, and we will see you on Monday.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I appreciate you joining me today.
Great. Have a good weekend.